Hello, everyone, and welcome. If you're just coming on in now, you're here for the first of our Sunken Cities lecture series at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We have a fantastic audience with us tonight, so I just want to give enough time for everyone to get in and settled. So welcome again, everyone, to the first of our Sunken Cities lecture series hosted by the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. My name is Izzy Fuqua. I'm the Adult Programs Coordinator for the museum, and I've had the pleasure of working with the coordinating curator for the special exhibition, Dr. Peter Schertz, to select 5 fantastic scholars for our Sunken Cities lecture series, the first of which is tonight. So thank you all for tuning in. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to VMFA Director, Alex Margis.
Well, thank you, Izzy, and welcome everybody. As Izzy mentioned, this is the first of a 5-part lecture series that's going to explore the themes in this special exhibition, Treasures of Ancient Egypt Sunken Cities. We're going to have scholars and archaeologists and conservators who are going to present topics that shed new light on the fascinating discoveries behind this great treasure. Now, if you have not been to the exhibition, you are in for a treat. Sunken Cities is one of the most fascinating shows of antiquities I've ever seen. And of course, I started out my career as an archaeologist. So we want to say thanks to Dominion NG as the presenting sponsor and all of our sponsors for allowing us to bring this from the Egyptian Museum in Cairo to Virginia. This is the last stop on its American tour. It's already been to the British Museum and other museums around Europe and several museums in the United States in Los Angeles, Minneapolis, and St. Louis, and now finishing in Richmond, Virginia. And so this lecture tonight, which is going to be quite fascinating, explores the complex relationship between the 2 superpowers in the ancient Nile Valley, the Kingdom of Kush down in Nubia, and then obviously the Egyptian kingdom itself. And so I want to say thank you, Izzy, for all of your hard work to get this queued up, but also to Peter Schertz and our entire curatorial and exhibition team, all the people that made it. And I will tell you this, a couple of weeks ago, the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Egyptian Antiquities. This is the person who is in charge of all of the archaeological sites, of everything around ancient Egypt. He came to tour the exhibition. He was stunned. Of all of the places that this exhibition is toured, he thought this installation, the lighting, the design, the flow, the colors, everything were absolutely perfect. By far the best on its tour. So to our team and to Peter, who's been our coordinating curator here on this end, thank you very much. Because obviously, and that was not praise except in earnest, and to come from somebody of his stature was heartwarming to all of us. Tonight, we have Dr. Caroline Rocheleau, who is the curator of ancient art at the North Carolina Museum of Art down in Raleigh. And if you've not been down there lately, they opened a new building 10 years ago, just about the same time, in fact, a month earlier than us. And they have a splendid collection of ancient material from the ancient Mediterranean, as well as the ancient Americas. And she's the curator overseeing all of those collections. Caroline has a PhD from the University of Toronto. She's originally from Quebec, and her PhD is in Egyptology and Nubiology. She's focused on art, architecture, and archaeology of the ancient Sudan and Egypt. And tonight she's going to be talking about these 2 kingdoms and 2 superpowers in the ancient Nile Valley. In her spare time, in addition to lecturing across the country and abroad, she's a board member of the International Committee for Egyptology, and she is also a member of the International Council of Museums, ICON. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our colleague and our neighbor, Dr. Caroline Rocheleau.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction, and also thank you for inviting me to lecture for this wonderful program. As Alex mentioned, I will be talking about the superpowers of the Nile Valley. I think this is very relevant today to remind ourselves that ancient Egypt is an ancient African civilization. And I think also it's perhaps even more important to note that Egypt is not the only ancient civilization along the Nile, that there is another one, the Kingdom of Kush, that is very often left out of the history books. So today what I would like to do is explore these two civilizations and side by side, see how they interact with each other. And as I go through the slides with you, as I talk about Egypt and Kush, what I would like you to do is try to view Nubia and Kush on their own terms as cultures different from ancient Egypt, and not to see them through a lens that is biased by ancient Egypt. And if you are able to do that, you're actually a whole lot better than the archaeologists and explorers who explored Nubia 100 years plus ago. So Nubia, many of you might associate the Aswan Dam and the transfer of the superb temples that we have there.
Caroline, I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
I'm not sure we're seeing your PowerPoint if you're wanting it to be up right now.
Yes, it is up. Let's try again.
If any of our participants would like to jump on the chat and let us know if they're seeing it, that would be great. Okay, I'm seeing it now, Caroline. Thank you.
Okay.
So sorry.
That's all right. There we go. We call this the curse of the pharaohs. Okay, so as I was saying, Nubia, which I hope now you can all see, you may know this because of the Aswan Dam and the temples that were removed, so to save them from the flooding of Nasser and Lake Nubia. Nubia is the land of the cataracts, and cataracts are these rapids along the Nile River that make sailing a little bit more arduous than it does in Egypt proper. Now, the ancient Egyptians called this land the land of the bow in reference to the phenomenal archers that came from south of the border. And here we see two lovely images, a model from the Middle Kingdom and a relief from the Old Kingdom showing the Nubian archers with their bows and their arrow. This was the general term for this part of south of the border. Kush specifically is Upper Nubia, and we will be talking about three main areas, three major cities in the Kingdom of Kush: Kerma, Napata, and Marawi that you see on the map here. So Kush is really that big S bend of the Nile right here. That is the Kingdom of Kush. This is the modern, the ancient frontier border with Egypt. This is the modern one right here. So Nubia is actually a geographic region both in Egypt and in Sudan. So in our excursion today, we will be following this chronological framework, comparing and contrasting Egypt and Sudan. You're more likely to be familiar with Egypt than Sudan. So I want to use that as sort of your base to introduce these important cultures from Nubia. During the Old Kingdom, which is the age of the pyramids, We know that the Egyptians sent expeditions to Nubia. We know this from tomb inscriptions, biographies of people who were sent down there as expedition leaders. From even before the Old Kingdom, the Egyptians had realized that Nubia had great resources, minerals, lots of gold, incense, oils, ebony, animals that were not living in Egypt. So the Egyptians basically go shopping in Nubia to get all this material. So we see some of these examples here: ostrich eggs, ebony wood, some gold. Here's a cute little monkey, some ostrich feathers, incense down here, elephant tusk. We have leopard skins. And traveling to Nubia is not necessarily easy, but as you can see on the map, there are desert routes that you can take to get there because the Nile is hard to navigate because of these cataracts. In the Middle Kingdom, clearly something is happening down south because suddenly the kings of this period start building forts in the Second Cataract region. So there is a power, sort of a phantom menace, if you will, that the Egyptians know is there, and that makes them very weary. And they start building these forts. And when you look at the map, it really brings the point home. You have a dozen forts right there, or lookouts and signaling posts of all over the Second Cataract. And some of these, like the fort at Buhan, is absolutely massive. This enormous mud brick structures, keeping an eye on what's going on south of the border is what the Egyptians, they're doing. They're still trading, but there's something that is actually worrying them. And that phantom menace is the Kingdom of Kerma, situated near the Third Cataract. It's a rather large city. 25 hectares is about 62 football fields. So that's quite large. And I'm giving you some information here about the excavations. It's been dug up in the 19-teens and is still being explored today by the Swiss mission since the 70s. This is a plan of the city. If you were to visit the National Museum in Khartoum, you see it's a very large city. This does not include the cemeteries. And the center of this city is this large mud brick building called a defufa, which actually means mud brick building. And so this is really at the center, at the core of this ancient city. It has multiple phases of construction. And if you were lucky enough to go on top, as I did, first let me show you, this is what it looks like on the inside. If you go on top, you'll see the surrounding landscape and the buildings that are there. And one thing we do notice about the Kerma architecture is that you have a lot of circles or arcs in the buildings. That's not just square buildings. And you find this actually in other parts of Sudan, in modern Sudan and modern African countries as well. But it is quite noticeable here how different this actually is from ancient Egypt. If you look at the city here, you can see those huts, and some of them are fairly large. The one on the drawing is probably where the king held court and where people came in to talk to him. There are actually two defufas in Kerma. The second one is located in the cemetery, and it has this one room inside. This is also surrounded by tombs. And the tombs, the burials in the Kerma culture are tumuli. So these dome-shaped burials over this structure in the ground where you put the body of the deceased. Now, what you see here on the screen is one of the most remarkable of these tumuli, a royal tomb. And this is something that you do not see in Egypt at all whatsoever. this array of skulls of bovines. So basically cattle. You have also some rams and sheep on there. The Kerma culture, very much like some modern Sudanese culture, like the Dinka, for example, their wealth is in cattle. And you see this as really this person was extremely wealthy. Just like the Egyptians, the Nubians put grave goods in their burial, and you'll notice it's much more sparse than what you find in Egypt, but nonetheless some ceramics, usually a few tools, jewelry. Something that's quite noticeable is the bed on which the deceased lies. What you will notice here, for example, you also have other individual buried with the main person, and these are actually human sacrifice. The Egyptians stopped doing that pretty early on, but it does continue in Kerma culture. Here is an example of a reconstructed bed with these wonderful inlays in ivory, sometimes also in mica. Even today in modern Sudanese society, the bed is very important. This is what people sit in, and this is what people lie on when they're going to sleep. This is also where a person is laid for a funeral, is a bed. Kerma produced some absolutely phenomenal ceramics. These here are typical classic Kerma pots, beakers, absolutely fantastic. They're handmade, not made with a wheel, handmade, super fine, super thin, absolutely amazing. And it makes the Egyptians, slightly older, black top, red ware, rather coarse in comparison. So the Kushite potters at Kerma are extremely skilled. In the cemetery, George Reisner, who was the excavator, discovered a bunch of Egyptian things. And this led him to believe that the Great Defufa in the city was the residence of the governor of this colony, and that Egyptians resided there, and that these were their burial. This did not acknowledge the fact at all that we are in a completely different part of the Nile Valley with a different culture. This had to be Egyptian. These accomplishments could not be anything but. Now let's travel back to Egypt for a moment during the Second Intermediate Period. That's what the SIP means. And we're now between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. And during the intermediate periods, usually Egypt is divided up in different sort of rival factions ruling different parts of the country. The royal central power is not as defunct, so the country is divided up. And during several decades, we see people coming from Palestine, from the Near East, coming in and settling into Egypt. So these immigrants have come in, and with this sort of fractured rule, gained power enough to actually start ruling that part of Egypt by themselves. And these are called the Hixos, who are set up at Avaris in the north, as you can see on the map here. So you have the Hixos in the north, you have the Nubians in the south, who, because the power is fractured, have moved up to where those fortresses are. And the king of, or the prince, maybe I should say, of the Egyptian resistance, who's trying to bring the country back under one rule, he's complaining that he's wondering why am I supposed to be king? They're the foreigners in the north, the Kushites in the south. I'm splitting this country with them. And he ponders this. In a second stela that we have, he tells us that he actually captured a spy that was sent from Avaris, from the Hyksos, to Kush. asking them to join forces so that they could sandwich the Egyptians between the two parties. And so, of course, people like, oh yeah, the spy was captured. And nobody ever thought that Kush would even do anything about this had they received the message. Well, about 18 years ago, the world was shocked, and by the world, I mean more the scholarly world, as this inscription was revealed during some conservation treatment in the tomb of a governor called Sobeknacht at El Kab. And I will read this inscription, what it says. And it's basically Sobeknacht telling us what happens. And he says, "Listen, you who are alive upon the earth. Kush came, aroused along its length, it having stirred up the tribes of Wawat, the land of Punt, and the Medjau. They swept over the mountains, over the Nile without limit." And basically that tells us, for the first time ever, that a second spy was sent, and that Kush actually had the power and the might in its army to actually go up to Egypt to squish the Egyptians out between them and the Hixos. And when that small, tiny inscription, just 22 lines, basically changed how we perceive Kush and Kerma, because nobody thought that this could actually even happen, that this was even possible. Now, with just this little bit of information, when you look at these images again, what you have should be a different story altogether. What this is actually war booty. This is the Kushites going up to Egypt, creating havoc, scaring the bejesus out of the Egyptians, and coming back home with things that they have plundered. The Kush is not an Egyptian colony. It is a separate kingdom, and this is what they brought back after the expedition to Egypt. During the New Kingdom, things go a little bit worse for Nubia because Egypt decides that they don't want to be ever ruled by foreigners again, don't want to be threatened by anybody south of the border or in the Levant, and decides to basically create an empire of sorts, and Nubia is colonized. That also gives the Egyptians direct access to all the resources that we talked about earlier. And as you can see from this map on the right of your screen, if you look, this is the border between the two areas. There's about just 2 mines on this map here, gold mines. If you look at what Nubia has, this is the mother lode of gold mines. And the New Kingdom, all the riches that you see in the tombs, really that all comes from Nubia. And I think none of the other kingdoms, Old, Middle, and later, have as much gold as Egypt has during this period. The Egyptians also justified their march onto Nubia and conquering the territory because of this mountain in Jebel Barkal, the pure mountain, because this mountain reminded them of the uraeus, the snake worn on the crown of the king of Egypt. This pinnacle here reminds them of that. They also say that this is where the god Amun resides, in this mountain, and the god Amun is the god of creation, or I should say a god of creation, of fertility. He's also a sun god, and he is the god of kingship. He came to prominence during the Middle Kingdom, but in the New Kingdom, he is really the god of Egypt. And he's the god of kingship. He lives in this mountain. Therefore, the Egyptians have every right to be there. And so they colonize Nubia. What happens too with the image of the god Amun at this time is interesting because in Egypt, he's depicted as a man wearing a flat crown with 2 tall plumes and a sun disk. In Nubia, if you look on the right, Suddenly, he doesn't have a human face anymore. He has a ram head instead. And this is probably the only thing that the Egyptians borrowed from the ancient civilizations of Kush. From Kerma was discovered many years ago, this contraption made out of ostrich feathers attached to a ram's head. You see this even earlier than Kerma, prehistoric rock carving, where you see a ram with this sort of contraption, sort of like a solar disk on its head. And this is how the ram version of Amun in Nubia came to be, or that's the most likely explanation. You might say, oh, well, I've been to Egypt. I've seen all those rams in front of the temple of Amun at Karnak. These are actually not rams. These are ram-headed sphinxes, so a ram head with the body of a lion. In Sudan, the temples of Amun all have these wonderful, really fat and fluffy rams in front of their temples, and it is a full ram. It is not a cryo-sphinx. Now going back to Kerma really, really quickly. So during this period, the Egyptians, they razed Kerma to the ground, and about 10 kilometers away have the city of Dukey Gale, where you see the juxtaposition of both type of architecture. Again, those circular motifs from Kerma, and you have these Egyptian style temples right there. You see them right here. You look at this, this is absolutely stunning. You don't see things like this in Egypt. Just a quick word here. I'm pulling up this slide because Tombos is actually a colonial town of Egypt, Egyptian colonial town, I should say, in fortification. But excavations at the cemetery tell us that there was the local people and the Egyptian actually were friendly with each other. They tried to make the best of the situation. And in the cemeteries, you have people who are buried in purely Egyptian or purely Nubian burials. But you also find people who have perhaps a mostly Nubian burial with some Egyptian features, or the reverse. This is not quite a hybrid, it's more like a cultural entanglement, but people are inspired by different things from both cultures and basically use that in their burial goods and their daily life as well. So the Egyptians and the Nubians can be friendly and have been friendly for most of their history. And this here really tells us. Now, you might have thought that so far my narrative has been really more all about Egypt, telling us what Nubia is. And the reason for that is that Nubia, until this point, does not have writing. The Nubians do not tell us anything about them. Everything is oral history, and we don't have, obviously, any of that preserved unless it's written down. So until the 800s, there's no writing at all whatsoever. When they do have writing, the Kushites adopt Egyptian as a language, but also Egyptian hieroglyphs as their writing system. And it won't be until the Marawitic period that they actually write their own language with a script that is made up of Egyptian hieroglyphs, but only 23, not the 700 plus that you have in ancient Egypt. And fortunately for us, the Marawitic language has not been deciphered. We don't know what the language is. So for most of its history, Nubia has no voice. It means archaeologists have to really rely on the material culture that is being excavated and what other people tell us about Nubia, but never the Nubians, except during the Napatan period, which we're talking about right now. So again, centered around that mountain, it is a fairly large region with multiple archaeological sites. And as you can imagine, the Nubians use exactly the same tactic and decide that after they've started a new dynasty at Napata, that they too will use the god Amun, who is the god of kingship over Nubia and Egypt, and this gives them the reason to take over Egypt. Now, the Nubians don't actually see themselves as foreigners in this case. They kind of see themselves more as savior, because during this time, Egypt is fragmented again, and there are various rulers that have little tidbits of the country. So the Nubians are going up to put Egypt back together again. And I'll just go briefly through some of the major kings here. But the one that united all of Nubia was King Kashta, and he named himself King of Upper and Lower Egypt, even though he was not in Egypt at all. But he established his daughter as God's wife of Amun, which is an extremely powerful religious position with political connotation. So again, the god Amun is used here to create ties between the two cultures. Pianki was the one who actually went up with his army and united Egypt under one rule, this time Kushite rule, starting de facto the Nubian Dynasty, the 25th dynasty of Egypt. King Shabitko, his claim to fame is that he is now the second king of this dynasty. Until a few years ago, he was the third one. The order got switched. But Shabako is better known than Shabitko as having been the one who transcribed this old moldy papyrus onto a stone, because the religious text he thought was very important and needed to be preserved. And this text is actually the Memphite theology of creation. And so basically how Egypt or the world was created according to the city of Memphis and the god Ptah. And if it weren't for Shabako, this document would have been lost for all eternity, because it was on a moldy papyrus and it is now on a stone. The most famous of all these kings is King Taharka. He's famous because he saved Jerusalem from the Assyrians, and that's how he ended up being mentioned in the Bible. Taharka, throughout his entire reign, is stuck having to make sure the Assyrians do not invade. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. There's lots of trouble brewing in the Near East at this point, and he's stuck trying to fix things, and clearly it does not work. Memphis gets sacked, eventually sacked again, and Taharka just flees back to Nubia, and that's where he dies before being able to do anything else. Taharka was probably the most prolific of all these kings, having built at Karnak here. If you've been there, that's Taharka's column, part of a big kiosk that was erected there. He built temples in Nubia, and as you can tell, these temples are not as well preserved. The materials, unfortunately, in Nubia, the sandstone is extremely friable. Things do not preserve very, very well. His successor is the last king of the 25th dynasty, Tanwet Amani. He has the same issues with the Assyrians, and eventually the Nubians just give up. It's like, it's not worth the trouble, and go back home to rule for another 3 years, but the kingdom of Kush lasted for another 1,000 years. So during this period, the Kushite kings adopt the pyramid as their burial. As you can see here, they're much smaller than the ones in Egypt. Much pointier, and that means that it's much easier to construct, and there are more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt. The interior of these burial chambers located underneath the pyramid are decorated in Egyptian style with Egyptian religious texts on the walls. The only king that is not buried with the other 25th dynasty rulers is King Taharka. He is buried here at Nuri. Everybody else is buried here at El Kuru. And King Taharka's tomb, and you can see here an amazing photo of the excavations with the 1,070 shaptis. These are magic figurines to do your work for you in the afterlife being sorted out. It's absolutely phenomenal. Now, I thought Peter would probably strangle me if I did not mention the Napatan king that is at the VMFA, King Senkamoniskan. The statue came from Boston, who got a share of the finds when Reisner was excavating, and that's how the VMFA got it. And it was discovered in these pits at Jebel Barkal, where that special mountain is. Lo and behold, in 2003, another pit, the first one was discovered in the 19-teens. In 2003, another pit, this time was discovered at Kerma with sculptures from these different, these kings, Senkamoniskan being one of them. So Taharka, Tanwit Amani, Senkamoniskan, Enlamani, and Aspelta. These are the kings that keep being reproduced in these massive, fantastic sculptures. And they're Napatan kings. And it was a big surprise in 2008 when at the dig site where I work at Dengale, which is in the Marawi heartland, we're very far away from Napata, we discovered these same statues. And here's Senkamoniskan as well. So we're still trying to figure out what these statues are there and why they're broken the way they are. This is probably a ritual breaking, deactivating the statues because they're all broken at the neck, at the knees, at the ankle. And we don't have so much of a pit here, but they're all grouped together. And they're all associated with levels of fire and destruction. So in the last section we'll deal with is during the Roman Empire, what is the relationship between Egypt and Nubia? And unfortunately, it did not start on a good foot. A few years after Egypt became part of the Roman Empire, the Nubians rebelled and revolted against the Romans because the Romans wanted to tax them, like heavy taxes, and Lower Nubia said, we don't want to. And the Nubians invaded the southern part of Egypt. The Upper Nubians, Kush, actually heard about this and came to their rescue, if you will, bringing reinforcements. Unfortunately, the king Teratekas died en route, but his wife took command of the army, and she was the one who negotiated with Caius Petronius. There were some skirmishes, things didn't go so well, but she managed to sit him down at a table and said, dude, we need to come to an agreement. She never wavered, and she managed to get a very good agreement from the Romans that basically went back to what the Greeks had with that little buffer zone between the two, leaving the Nubians out of it, not charging any taxes and stuff like that. And so this queen was Queen Amani Reinas, one of the forgotten female figures, important female figures in history. So as you can imagine, the Kushites took some souvenirs from their time in Aswan, Elephantine, and brought those back home. And this wonderful head of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, was found right here at the small temple at the city of Marawi, underneath the steps. And every single time the priest went in and out, they stepped on the head of Augustus. And it was basically them saying, take that, Roman Empire, you're never coming into our country. And the Romans never did manage to conquer Nubia. Eventually they gave up pretty quickly. So Kush never was part of the greater Roman Empire. It was always at the border, but maintained a cordial relationship with Rome and the greater Mediterranean. Now, most of our sources about this are coming from Roman authors. There is this one stela in Meroitic that tells us that is very likely related to this conflict between Marawi and Rome, because the word Areme that we see on the stela is what most people think is the Marawitic name for Rome. It mentions Amani Renas on this stela. So we really, really hope that one day, very soon, this language will be deciphered so we know what the Nubians thought of this and get their side of this conflict. The city of Marawi had been occupied for a while before the capital city moved there. And even later, the cemetery moved there as well, probably because there was an attack by one of the Egyptian kings. So the city of Marawi is right here, and it includes a big Amun temple, again, very important. Even though it's an Egyptian god, it has become one of the most important gods in the Nubian pantheon. And Marawi is also famous for its wonderful pyramids. So we have the necropolis right here with that we'll get into in a minute. Now Marawi, here's the temple of Amun at Marawi with that lovely ram. Again, we are faced with the same problem. In this part of Sudan, you do have monsoon rains. So that is absolutely destructive to the archaeological remains. And a lot of the temples need to be reburied to avoid the sites being destroyed from the water, from the rains. Marawi is famous for its royal baths, something you don't see in the other two kingdoms we talked about. At the bottom of this royal bath, you have these wonderful statues that are clearly influenced by the greater Mediterranean. We call this lovely lady the Venus of Marawi. This guy almost looks Etruscan. And this is this wonderful mix of African, Egyptian, and Mediterranean all in one that you find in Kushite art. And that's absolutely phenomenal, that they remain very African, yet are borrowing from other cultures. Marawi is also known as the first iron smelting, iron producing kingdom in Africa. Don't ask me about this. I'm just pointing that out because that is important, but I know nothing about iron smelting. I know more about pyramids, and these are the pyramids at Marawi. And these pyramids are actually, don't have rooms inside the pyramid itself. It's filled with rubble. And these pyramids, because Marawi was said to be a city of fabulous riches, you can imagine what has happened to these pyramids over the decades, especially in the 18th century, for example, 19th century, when explorers were going through looking for treasure. Here's the pyramid of one of the other Kendakes, Amani Shaheto. Kendake is a ruling queen. You find this in Nubia way more than Egypt. Nubia is also, Kush is actually from Marawi, is a matrilineal as well. And she is famous mostly for her treasure, which is absolutely phenomenal. Exquisite craftsmanship, wonderful jewelry. And the person who found it, Giuseppe Ferlini, basically destroyed the pyramid from the top down, trying to, searching for treasure. And this is what the Queen's pyramid looks like today. The burial chamber is underneath the pyramid, and clearly there was no need to destroy it. If he had asked a few locals, they probably would have figured that out pretty quickly. Amenhotep is another queen I want to mention. We're almost done. Amenhotep, kind of like Taharka, was a great builder, and she built the temple of Amun at Dukey Gale, where I work. She also restored other temples and built other temples. Here she is, smiting enemies, just like that same Egyptian motif that you see the Nubians adopt that. Here is the temple of Apedemak, the local Nubian god of war. the Roman Kiosk, just to show you the fun architecture that you see when you have this blend of culture. The Roman Kiosk, that's actually a temple to Hathor from Naga. And this one, I mean, you cannot get more African than this. This is at Musawarat the Sufra. It's a large platform, there's a temple in there, but one of the walls, there's this wonderful elephant carved sort of at the end of the wall. And it's absolutely quite lovely and very intriguing. That's some of the wonders and the Kingdom of Kush. And on my note, I would like very quickly to read this to you. This is a quote from the Kingdom of Kush written by Derek Welsby. And he says, consideration of the Kushites alongside such giants of the ancient world as the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians is justified on account of the longevity of the kingdom and of its size, if for no other reason. At the same time when Rome was a small village on the banks of the Tiber, and the Greek city-states held sway over minuscule territories, the Kushites ruled an empire stretching from the central Sudan to the borders of Palestine. I agree with him. And my question is, why is this not in the history books? Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. That was phenomenal. We do have quite a few questions. I hope you'll consider. The first is more recent, the one that you at the end of your show regarding the Nubian Queen's treasure, that beautiful jewelry that you showed. Can you give a location as to where that is now? Is it in a private collection or?
Luckily, no. It's in two museums. It's in Munich and in Berlin. When Ferlini was actually trying to sell his treasure, nobody wanted to touch it when he said that this came from, from Sudan. Nobody could even believe that such fabulous jewelry was produced by an African kingdom. Nobody wanted to touch it. Lepsius, who was an archaeologist who worked in Sudan, heard about this, and he managed to convince the king of Prussia to buy this. Like, this is extremely important. I think a lot of people were thinking it was like bad Egyptian art or like bad Egyptian jewelry. It's not quite right because it's not Egyptian. That's the thing, right? And he's like, no, this is very important. You need to get this collection. And so the king of Prussia bought half of the collection on the recommendation of Lepsius, who told him, what you have down there is an important African king. You need to get this. And that's the only reason it didn't end up in a private collection, is because this archaeologist was really, knew what he was talking about. He had worked in Sudan. He knew that this was not an Egyptian colony. It was a separate culture that needed to be remembered. And thank God he did manage to convince the king. And so those can be seen now if you go to Germany. Yeah.
That is remarkable. I wondered if you wouldn't mind sharing your PowerPoint just one more, and maybe going back to that first map of the Nile River, so that we can see that relationship between Egypt and Nubia.
Yeah.
And while you're doing that, we did get a couple of questions towards the beginning of your presentation about the tombs, the Kerma tombs.
Yes.
So
I'm gonna go to, it'll be easier if I go to the slide from my computer.
Perfect, yes, take your time.
Yep. So the very, very first one at the beginning.
Yes, that would be great. Yeah, that Nile River, I think that'll be helpful. So people were having questions about the tombs that we were talking about, the Kerma tombs.
Yep.
The first is that they looked pretty empty. And is that an accurate depiction of what they would have looked like in ancient times when they were sealed, or is that after years of robbing and looting?
There is definitely some looting, and let's see if I can go to one. Like this one, I think is after the excavations. Mm-hmm. Because that's one of the ones that had some treasure in it. but that's one, obviously this one does not have any Egyptian sculpture, but that's typical of a few burial goods. This one, I think that's a horse or maybe a dog. So the horse burials, you do have sometimes horses in there or other animals, but not a lot. The Nubian tombs are not as garnished and like Egyptian tomb. If you think of King Tut in your head, I mean, this is stuff galore. Everything you could ever think of, you know, including food for the afterlife. If you have a jar with food in it, that is enough. It sort of magically can appear for you in the afterlife. You don't need the whole grocery store. You just need one that can magically be provided to feed your soul, because you don't need to be fed. You just need your soul to be nourished.
I see.
So that's typical. Yeah.
Right. That's fascinating. And I appreciate the, you know, maybe we are more used to that idea of Egyptian tombs and this lavish nature. And this is a follow-up question to that. The purpose of human sacrifice in the Kerma burial, were those people to be servants in the afterlife? Is that another thing that you could expand on?
Yes, I think that's what it is. Yeah, sort of the servants for the person, especially if the person is a king or a very well placed official. You would have more than one person. Yeah, the Egyptians got very, very early on and decided it was sort of barbaric to force people to dive to be their, you know, servant in the afterlife. That's why they came up with the shabtis. The little figurines and everything on the tomb walls that is represented, everything you put in the tomb will be available magically for you. And here you don't have any representation of that. You actually just have physical objects. For in ancient Egypt, all those drawings may ensure that you have that as well, not just what's in your tomb.
Yeah. Well, so the locations of these tombs and burial sites in the present day, are they in the middle of the desert? Are there towns around them? Could you give us a little bit of maybe what they look like in the present day?
Yes, I've been to Kerma only in the town. I didn't go into the cemetery. The cemetery is I think a couple miles away. But as you can see here, this is near enough the Nile. So on one side you will have the Nile. Usually the cemeteries are further in the desert to ensure if they're flooding, for example, you want that land there to be for the agriculture. And if you look back, and let me move back to that map. This one, I mean, the Nile is not very wide, and especially in Nubia, there's very specific areas that are more arable than others. Like the region around Kerma, that's a little bit greener. This area is a little bit greener. The rest is very, very dry. But you have to remember that in ancient times, it wasn't quite as dry as it is today. This was more of a savanna type environment.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, their desertification starts in Egypt around the end of the Middle Kingdom. There's a great famine because of that, where things like climate change impacted the Old Kingdom, where you have people who normally thrived on the borders, on the edge of the desert, now have to move into the Nile Valley because there's no more water. Things are drying up. So that happened at the end of the Old Kingdom.
Fascinating. So even the landscape that we think of today is very different from the time that we're discussing. So that's,
yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Maybe just two more questions and then we can wrap up. I remember I've just been a delight to listen to you and Peter talk, but you were talking about how, you know, there are so many circles in this presentation and how that is very un-Egyptian. So I was wondering, someone actually asked if they studied constellations and if that had any connection to the Minoans or other cultures, that kind of cross-cultural connection. Is there any connection there?
That I don't know. Circles seem to be very organic. I think there's a nice flow. And I think it's also easier if you're building in mud brick with mud surfaces, with twigs and branches, not to have angles. And it's something that you still see in some parts of Africa today and other parts of the world, obviously. It's just, I think it's just a little bit more organic because of the materials you're using. At that point, I don't know if there's much connections with Kush to the greater Mediterranean. That comes much later with the Marawites, and basically through the Roman Empire have contacts that extend all the way through India. Kerma doesn't have that. Their contacts is further south into Africa. The thing is with Kerma, it is such a shame that there is no written documents. I mean, we could learn so much because a lot of it is very, very mysterious. We would love to know more information about that. Sometimes the archaeological remains bring more questions than answers.
Well, and I have a feeling many of our audience members now are asking the same questions that maybe plague you when you're on your digs, questions that maybe we won't have answers to. But thank you so much for your time tonight and your expertise. This was a wonderful talk and a wonderful way to kick off our Sunken Cities lecture series. I'm so grateful to you and your time and your willingness to present virtually. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate.
Of course. Well, hopefully you'll get to Richmond to see the exhibition. And I invite all of you to, with us tonight to please visit VMFA if and when you feel safe to do so. Please do look at our website to see all of the safety precautions we have in place and to reserve your tickets for the exhibition. It is wonderful. And if you can join us for a future lecture, our next talk is on Remembering Osiris with Dr. Robert Rittner from the Art Institute of Chicago. So please go to the website and register for that event. Thank you, Caroline. And we'll see everyone next month.